Hello, let's talk about some of the environmental problems with producing food on a large scale. So we're looking here at problems with industrialized agriculture. Just a couple of numbers that I want you to know. Agriculture itself accounts for at least 25% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. If you watch Cowspiracy, they will talk more about this in detail. So agriculture itself is a huge producer of greenhouse gases. Now, usually when we think about greenhouse gases, what comes to mind are carbon dioxide and methane, both of which are, yes, greenhouse gases, but the most potent of the greenhouse gases that are human-produced is nitrous oxide. As you can see here, nitrous oxide has about 300 times the strength or the warming capacity of carbon dioxide. And so nitrous oxide correlates with industrialized agriculture because it's widely released when we are creating or producing inorganic fertilizers, things like Miracle-Gro. And it's also produced when animals are defecating. And so nitrous oxide is probably the worst of the human-generated greenhouse gases, and nitrous oxide has a tight correlation with industrialized agriculture. All right, so let's talk some details about problems with agriculture. The first problem that I want to get into is topsoil erosion. Now, hopefully at this point in time, you know the answer to this question. How is soil naturally held in place? Of course, if you don't know the answer to that question, the answer is the roots of plants. The roots are going to help anchor the soil down. So therefore, when we've got agriculture and we're harvesting plants and removing the roots, then there comes the problem of potential for more erosion. And again, just a review question here. What is erosion? Talked about this way in the beginning of the year, back in the beginning of chapter 14, I think. Erosion itself is just simply moving rocks and soil and things from one place to another. Now, obviously here, if we're talking soil erosion, we're talking about moving the soil from one location to another. Erosion caused by nature, could be wind, could be water flowing. Human causes for erosion, farming, again, as we're removing the plants and removing the roots, that's going to allow the soil to be moved a lot easier. Clear cutting, which goes along with that. Overgrazing, if I'm letting my cattle stay in one place for too long of a time, then they're going to graze the grass down to the roots, and it will not give the grass stems a chance to regenerate. And so that could lead to erosion. Off-road vehicles, things like tractors, etc., etc. Tilling, which is using it could be by hand or using machinery on large scale to stir up the soil to make room for plant roots and water to percolate through. Tilling and stirring up the soil can also lead to more chances of erosion. So topsoil erosion goes hand in hand with planting of our crops. The problems with erosion is that, number one, we're not only moving the soil particles, but we're also moving the nutrients that are absorbed onto those soil particles. Now, remember, we talked in chapter 3 about nutrient cycling. And so a lot of these nutrients are moving from one region of the earth to another because they're attached to different soil particles like sand, silt, and clay. And so as the soil is moving from one place to another, the soil is losing those valuable nutrients. And if we lose soil nutrients, then what a farmer needs to do is figure out a way to replenish those nutrients in the soil. And they can do that either through using inorganic fertilizers, which is not good for the environment, like I just mentioned with nitrous oxide. They can use other types of fertilizers. They can plant things like legumes. But the loss of soil fertility, because the soil is eroded, leads to other problems. The big one here, number 2, water pollution. So think about this. If you got a body of water located near your farm, then the soil that's blowing around is going to perhaps get blown into your body of water. And now you're going to get your body of water cloudy. It's going to be very turbid. Turbidity is a measure of the cloudiness of the water. And that can lead to problems. If the water is very turbid, then the phytoplankton that might be in the water won't receive enough sunlight to photosynthesize. So on a larger scale, what often happens around near farmlands near the Mississippi River is that this erosion into the Mississippi River causes a whole bunch of problems at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is down around Louisiana, ultimately resulting in a dead zone in the ocean, in the Gulf of Mexico. So dead zones, the word dead zone is just simply referring to an area of water where there's either low oxygen conditions, which is called hypoxic, Hypo, or no oxygen in the water, which is anoxic. The prefix "an" before a word means not or without, and the prefix "hypo" means low. So a dead zone is an area where there's either little to no oxygen in the water. And these dead zones ultimately can form through the practices of industrialized agriculture. So follow along with me here. So we've got farmers planting, we'll say, near the Mississippi River. There's a lot of farmland around there. So they're applying fertilizers in the springtime to begin growing their crops. And then in the late spring, early summer, as they begin, harvesting some of their crops, you get some soil being eroded and washed into the Mississippi River. It's not just the soil, it's the fertilizers that are attached to those soil particles. They travel downriver, emptying out at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is in the Gulf of Mexico. And now you've got all these fertilizers washing into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, what happens is that the algae that are living naturally in the Gulf of Mexico, they love these fertilizers. They go through an algae bloom. They receive excess nutrients, which is the process of eutrophication, which you've heard before. So the Gulf of Mexico gets eutrophied. There's excess nutrients from those fertilizers from the farmlands. And so the algae undergo a huge population explosion. They love the nutrients, so they start reproducing like crazy, huge algae blooms, now covering the surface of the water. So you might think, well, algae is a type of phytoplankton. It photosynthesizes, it produces oxygen. So how do we get to this dead zone or anoxic or hypoxic conditions? Follow along with me. So we've got all this algae around the surface, blocking sunlight from like the plants that might be underneath. And let's say a fish swims through that algae bloom. Now these algae blooms can be really thick, and so the clumps of algae could get stuck in a fish's gills. If my gills were here, that's where I'm pointing. They could get stuck in a fish's gills and suffocate the fish. Depending on the species of algae, some species produce deadly toxins that could kill the fish. And it might not just be fish, it might be other marine organisms, other animals that are dying in these during these algae blooms. So regardless, we have a lot of dead creatures in this immediate area. And when these dead creatures begin decomposing, it's this process of decomposition that uses up a lot of oxygen. So when we have all these dead things and they begin decomposing, the decomposing bacteria use up a lot of the excess oxygen. And that's how we get to these conditions of hypoxia or anoxia, otherwise known as a dead zone. Dead zones most frequently form, at least for us here in the United States and the Gulf of Mexico, most frequently form in the late spring, early summer, because again, that's when people are doing the majority of their planting. I realize this map here, you can't see the caption that well, is a few years old, and every year the area of the dead zone increases by a few miles. I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but this is a predictable phenomenon that always happens around the same time because of the application of fertilizers. And then you can see the little key there. The lowest oxygen levels are the dark, deep red. And so, again, here's just a little graphic. I don't know if you can read that all, showing you the basic process of what creates a dead zone in the water. Now, at the top here, fertilizers on crops don't directly lead to erosion, but these are, two things that are just connected together. We apply fertilizers, we have some erosion, which leads to the process of eutrophication, which is where a body of water has excess nutrients. Eutrophication will lead to a population explosion of algae, which is known as an algae bloom. An algae bloom will kill fish, and these fish kills will then begin decomposing, and that's what uses up the oxygen. And that, my friends, is where we get our dead zones coming from. So, it's weird to think about the fact that, farmers many miles upstream from the Gulf of Mexico are contributing to these dead zones. But in fact, everything's connected together. That's the way it works here in the environment. So soil erosion can lead to loss of soil fertility, because the nutrients are being washed away, and it can also trigger dead zones in the ocean. This is from your textbook here, topsoil erosion. The red areas, serious concern, blue areas, some concern. So you can see most of the United States has a little bit of concern about erosion, at least in most of the contiguous United States. All right, let's talk about a second problem with industrialized agriculture, that being drought and desertification. I like to say desertification, but obviously it's deserts. So desertification is defined as when the productive capacity of the soil drops by more than 10%. And it's basically becoming a desert due to drought conditions or due to erosion and the inability to continue growing. Now, obviously, we are seeing more and more desertification happening due to the fact that we have climate change happening. And in many regions of the world, climate change is associated with increased temperatures. And so that kind of answered the second question I have here. What are the effects of climate change and desertification? Obviously, it's going to be happening more and more rapidly, or more and more frequently, might be a better term. This is another problem here, excessive irrigation. We know that cropland has tripled since the 1950s. Why? Human population has increased since the 1950s. Not only has the population increased, but as I've also said a couple of times now, the population around the world tends to be more affluent. And with affluence comes the ability and the desire to consume meat products. And meat products, or animal agriculture, requires grains to be fed to the meat, to the animals. And so that means we have to grow even more crops. The water that we're putting on our croplands, we're not using distilled water. We're using, generally speaking, water from groundwater or water from reservoirs. It has a little bit of salt in it. If you ever get a chance, take a look at my fish tanks in the classroom, except for the big one in the back because that's salt water. But the two smaller fish tanks, the one that the eel was in, and then the small 10-gallon tank, they both have bits of salt on the top covers, and that's because as the water evaporates away, those are both freshwater tanks, but as that water evaporates away, the little bit of salt that's in that water gets left behind, and it's coating the top of my tanks until I clean it off. And so when we excessively irrigate our crops and we're just flooding them, that means we're actually adding a little bit of salt to our cropland over many, many years, and those salts begin accumulating. And this is something called soil salinization. And what you're looking at in the picture here, that white area kind of right through here, that's an area where over many, many years of applying lots and lots of water, the salts have begun to accumulate. And that's what salinization is. Accumulation of salts in your upper soil layers. And obviously adding excess salts to your soil is going to affect the plants that can grow there. It's going to decrease your crop yields. It's going to make them grow slower, maybe not at all. It's going to ruin your soil because obviously a lot of plants that we're growing for our crops are not salt tolerant. And so soil salinization is a concern. It affects about 10% of the croplands in the world. So do I have that? No. The second problem with excessive irrigation is waterlogging. When something is waterlogged, it's like super saturated. And so in this case, when we're just flooding our croplands and just, using massive sprinkler heads and not really using anything focused like drip irrigation, things get waterlogged. And so waterlogging can be an issue because now my plant roots are just sitting in water. They're bathed in the water, and the plant roots might not be able to tolerate that. So waterlogging is a problem as well. And it's not just the water that's bathing the roots, but again, those dilute salts that are in the water. All right, so I'm going to get into one other problem here, but I'm running out of time because I have less than 40 seconds left because my videos are limited to 15 minutes. So I'm going to finish off the energy problem and talk a little bit more about greenhouse gases in one next video. So that's it for right now. Bye-bye.